Hello everyone, welcome to episode 2 of the R.A.W. podcast. We got our casual cast right here, Adele, Rod, me, myself, Wessel. But today we got a guest queued up, an expert in the Asian markets, especially in China. As we dive into the rise of Asia in gaming, welcome Daniel.
Hi.
We are happy to have you here.
Hi, very nice to meet you all. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here.
And I'm very excited with this conversation, guys. I've been following Daniel for years, literally years. We interacted very occasionally on socials, but I'm really happy. I think this is the first official time that we will be exchanging. And yeah, man, really excited to have you here and to learn all about you. So spill the deets. Who is Daniel?
I'm Daniel, I live in China. I never call myself an expert and I kind of hate when people do. I'm very suspicious of anyone who calls themselves an expert or anything, so I try not to do that for myself. But I've been here for almost 14 years now in Shenzhen. I've been living and breathing gaming really since I'm 2 years old, since I got the NES until now. Professionally, I have a background in marketing, in tech and e-commerce, and also in business development in gaming here, helping and supporting developers from around the world to launch their games in China, mobile, but also PC and console games. I'm super interested in hearing what's going on in the gaming scene. I think it's a fascinating market and country to explore and to talk about. So yeah, let's get to it.
I maybe got already a fun one for you. As you're based in China, you've been there for a while, you're looking out on the scene. What is the one thing that Western gamers often misunderstand about the Asian gaming market?
Oh, so many things. I wrote my first article for gamesindustry.biz exactly about that. It was called 5 Misconceptions About the Chinese Market. There's many. One very recurring very quickly, I think it's piracy. It's something I talked recently and I've been talking for many years. I think a lot of people in the West still think that China is a very backwards market and people are just pirating games and nobody buys games and stuff like that. Even professional pundits I hear in podcasts, influential people that still think that, which is absolutely absurd nowadays. It does not represent the market at all. Quite the opposite. So that's one. I would say that's one, but I could name dozens.
Personally, from my point of view, I've never really had the thought that piracy would be such a big thing in Asia or in China specifically. Is it something that comes from a further background, like
I think
more back in the day?
I think I just recently heard in a podcast, I don't want to name it, although I could.
Do it. What's the podcast?
It's called Game Face. It's a very good podcast. It's my favorite. It's from people that used to work for GameTrailers.com way back and G4 or something. Anyway, but they did mention that one time that they really think that everybody in China, basically the market's only mobile or only piracy for PC and console games. And that's totally not the case. And I hear it from many other people, even sometimes from developers I talk to. Because people, I think they have this misconception that China, it's all about PC and mobile. And I suppose many people still think that China is a very low income society and market. And therefore people will not traditionally buy games, which was true like 15, 20 years ago. Let's say, and before that, it does not represent at all what middle class and urban society is in China nowadays. So that's the main reason. But again, this is all about generalizations.
How would you say it works with console? So you're saying that mobile and PC, that's the stigma that many people have or could have. How does it look with console? Is PlayStation or Xbox? Do they have a big market in China? Is it the same as globally?
No, I mean, this is a very long topic, and please stop me or interrupt me because I can go on forever on this. But the market in China is very complex. This is what I write the most about actually online. For consoles specifically, we had a period of where consoles were banned from the early 2000s until 2014, I believe, or something like that. During that period, even though officially consoles were banned, there were still consoles in China. Consoles were just imported and people would buy them very easily. They were available everywhere. I used to live in Tianjin in 2008. And at the time when I was there, I used to go to a neighborhood that was just gaming, and I even bought a PS3 there at the time. So in China, there's very much this culture for gaming and for hardware in particular and consoles to have all consoles and all games available, but through imports. And what I mean by that is not individuals importing consoles or games. It's just there's a wide network of distributors in China they have the consoles on stock here, imported, well, from other regions. They're not necessarily imported, but they're from other regions, in particular from Japan and from Hong Kong and Taiwan, which are technically speaking different markets from mainland China. So most of the supply for consoles for the last 2-3 decades in China has been from those imported markets, which by consequence inflates sales numbers for those markets. So this is something I usually always tell people, like when you see sales numbers for, let's say, the Switch or the PS5 or other consoles, like in Japan, if they say like it sold a million consoles, a million units in a month, that means that at least probably 100,000 or so, it depends, are probably from mainland China actually, and not from Japan. And this has a huge impact on how different markets are perceived, especially neighboring markets here in East Asia and around China. But yeah, that's the market in China. There's the licensed consoles here that are like region locked, and they're licensed for distribution in China, and they're not imported. Those consoles, however, they sell less than the imported ones, precisely because they are region locked, although they're very easy to go around those limitations. We had the Switch until recently, had the agreement with Tencent, so they had the Chinese Switch. The PS5 as well has the official license model here. But again, the imported Switch models from Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and even from the US and Europe, they sold a lot more than the Tencent Switch. And the same for the PS4 and for the PS5 up until recently, although the licensed Chinese model for the PS5 is selling quite well now. The problem is, for imported consoles and games, nobody can track exactly how many they're sold in China, because they come from these other markets and because they are distributed and sold through a wide network of sellers, mostly online. And so there's no centralized source to know exactly how many units are sold. So nobody can know for sure. And whoever says they know, they're lying. They're just making up stuff. They're just making, at best, informed guesses, but nobody knows exactly. Even Sony or Microsoft or Nintendo, they cannot know how many consoles are sold in China, because again, most of them come from these other markets, so they only know how many they sold in those markets, so they don't know exactly how many actually end up in the hands of Chinese consumers. Anyway, I'm glossing over many details. I didn't even explain anything about regulations and why consoles need to be licensed to begin with in China, and games and all that. But just to give you a general idea, this is kind of it. Made
Daniel,
sense.
just a quick one from my side. It's always refreshing hearing someone dropping the hammer on these big publishers and that they don't know exactly what's happening in those markets. And I think we all understand the complexity of some markets. But I've heard something here that maybe some people is the first time that they are hearing about this. Could you please, in a very simplistic way, explain what does it mean for the end user purchasing a locked console? What does it mean, region lock, exactly?
Yeah, so for example, I'm going to use the example of the Switch because it's actually the most popular still. I estimate the most popular console still in China. If you buy a Chinese Switch, the Tencent licensed Switch, when you open the eShop, you will only find, using the Chinese account, you'll only find games in the eShop that have a publishing license for mainland China. So that means you'll only see there like maybe 20 games or something like that. There's very few games that have a publishing license for the Switch in China. This is basically the main restriction, and this is why Chinese consumers will generally, at least the more informed ones, will generally prefer to buy the imported models, which are almost the same price and widely available, even more than the licensed region lock consoles. So it's really about that. Like on the PS5, it's kind of the same. If you buy a Chinese model, the default setup for the console will put you in a Chinese mainland account. Well, now it's possible they just switch to a Hong Kong account, and then they have access to all the games. If they stick with the Chinese network, there's almost no games available officially. I don't use the Chinese models, and these things keep changing all the time. I keep seeing online that things keep changing and people keep going around it in different ways. So I might be out of date a little bit exactly how the restrictions work. This is my general understanding.
First thing that occurred me is that this basically creates a secondary market, a parallel market, not just for
Yeah.
consoles, but also for accounts and so on. It's very interesting how this actually influences consumer behavior, because we have to imagine that a lot of people are not as open-minded to find alternatives. The normal user will just play whatever is available. Political decisions, and we are not diving into the political spectrum here, actually have impact on what users consume and the way they consume.
Hmm. Yes, I think this is very important and is one of the misconceptions that people have about China. The market here is extremely flexible. So while those consoles, the imported ones, legally speaking, they are a loophole because they don't have a distribution license to be legally commercialized in China. However, if you open any e-commerce app in China, which is how most people buy things, at least electronics and stuff, there's no retail stores for games in China. I mean, there are some, but it's literally a drop in the ocean compared to what happens online. If people open those e-commerce platforms, what they will find is the imported consoles, like the models from Japan, from Hong Kong, whatever. And those are the ones that are openly promoted. So there's absolutely nothing hidden about it. There's nothing underground or niche about it. Even Sony themselves, the official Sony China, if you go to their official Chinese account, they keep promoting games that are not available in China officially. Like now they're promoting the next Ghost of Tsushima, Death Stranding 2, whatever. Any kind of game that comes out that basically will never have a publishing license in China. But Sony China, Sony PlayStation, they are actively promoting them. They release marketing materials. And, authorities absolutely do not care. It doesn't matter. It's just how the market works. If authorities were to crack down on that, it would be very awkward because then they would have to remind consumers and the public why they cannot have access to that. And that would just create more questions and would just upset people. So that's kind of how China, generally speaking, works. I mean, society, there's this social agreement contract between the people and the government where you let me do things as long as I'm not disrupting the harmony of society and the government. You just let me do whatever I want and everything is okay. So that's kind of how things work in the gaming industry, but also in general in China. And that's how I can explain that these parallel markets exist, even though they're parallel, but really they are widespread. And if you ask any uninformed Chinese person, they maybe won't even realize it's a parallel market. It's just what they know. It's just what's available.
It's really refreshing hearing this from you, because I have to agree there's a lot of misconceptions and
Mm-hmm.
lack of understanding of how those markets operate. But I've been saying something from years. I've been exposed to several Asian markets, and anyone that still ignores the potential of the Asian market, specifically China, is basically looking at the fastest growing stadium in the world, period, and insisting that the stadium is empty. I've seen this, and this takes me to my next topic. We attended Gamescom the last week, and the place was massive, was packed. But in both the B2B area and the B2C area, something that caught my eye was the presence of several Asian countries. And again, specifically China, but there was, I would say that China, South Korea, Japan, obviously, these were the strongest ones, and then you could see a bit of everything. But anyway, the B2B part was packed, like packed, even known developers, known publishers, unknown developers, unknown publishers, but packed. You had developers, publishers, peripherals, hardware, everything from Asia. I was very impressed. And then going to the consumer side, to be honest, was very surprising to me this year because they had a full hall and was packed. What was impressive was the massive presence of Asian developers. This is a sign that things are changing, that the market is changing, and that the Western markets are more open towards different genres. I think people perhaps are a bit fed up seeing the same IPs milked over and over again. A lot of the original IPs, original concepts, and original narratives are coming now from the Asian markets. You are there on site. Here we only have one, two, maybe three titles that exploded recently. The presence of Asian games in the Western markets for years, obviously, I don't need to mention those iconic IPs. But now I'm saying this newer generation. How, now the question, I bet you have access there to hundreds of titles that we can't even imagine. How do you see there being on site the consumer behavior more towards Western games or Westernized games, or people actually consume those games that are built locally? And then also your take on this new wave of Asian games being highly popular in Western markets.
Yeah, I think it's important to differentiate. I mean, this new wave, it's obviously mostly from China. I mean, Japan obviously has been very well established since the beginning of gaming. Needless to say, that there's nothing new about that. If anything, the Japanese market has been losing size and relevance commercially speaking, not so much creatively, but commercially speaking, has been losing relevance in the global context of the industry in later years. Even now, if you go to Japan, not that I've been recently, but if you go to Japan, to Tokyo, to Shibuya, to the Crossing, whatever, most of the ads you see for games are actually for Chinese games that look like anime games, but they're actually Chinese mobile games, because the mobile market in Japan is huge, which I think is something that people in the West don't quite really understand. They think that Japan is all about consoles and stuff, but actually mobile completely dominates nowadays the market in Japan by a large margin. But in China specifically, like you said about Gamescom, and that doesn't surprise me, frankly, in terms of hardware, in terms of accessories and all that, I'm willing to bet that 98% of more of those companies there are not only from China, but from Shenzhen specifically, because it's here that most of whole hardware, gaming hardware, is made. At least until now, it started to change a little bit for Vietnam and whatever because of the tariffs from the US. But still, for accessories, it's almost all from here. Now, from the gaming perspective, Chinese consumers, and obviously I'm not Chinese. I don't want to misrepresent people or talk on behalf of the Chinese population. That would be extremely arrogant of me. But from my understanding, the Chinese consumer is very much open to any kind of games, no matter the origin. But it also depends on platform and on demographics. For mobile, which is again the biggest slice of the market in China and in the world, this still accounts for at least somewhere between 49 and 51% worldwide, and even more so in China. For mobile in China, it's mostly Chinese games and very much Chinese themed games. So you have games like Honor of Kings and many still MOBAs and other more casual and hyper casual games that are very much made for Chinese audiences and for the Chinese markets. Now, the thing is, the Chinese market, the mobile, it's very competitive and it's kind of stagnated, it kind of plateaued. It's very hard for new developers, smaller developers, to compete with the big ones like Tencent and NetEase and MiHoYo. I mean, you mentioned games that we know in the West from China like Black Myth Wukong, but actually Impact is a Chinese game and it's one of the biggest games in the world. And the other ones from that company, I always forget the name, Oxstar Trail or whatever. But anyway, there's a few mobile games that are huge and are Chinese. So actually, the Western audiences have been introduced to Chinese games now for almost a decade or so. These big titles, not so much the premium and console games, but on mobile, yes. But the Chinese market, because it's so competitive and so stagnated and has so many strict regulations on mobile in particular, because they're much more easier to enforce on mobile, because everything is free to play, everything depends on local servers, everything depends on local monetization systems. So it's really hard to not go through the official regulations for those games. So Chinese developers in recent years found themselves in this situation where they really cannot find any space to grow in China, generally speaking. And that's why that partially, if not greatly, explains this explosion of games, not only mobile, but PC and console as well, coming out of China into the rest of the world. Like you said, you saw many indie games at Gamescom from China and other regions of Asia, but I'll stick to China just for the sake of the argument. And I'm willing to bet that most of those developers were doing mobile games before. And again, because they cannot find a space to grow, because mobile games depend on user acquisition, depend on huge budgets for marketing to grow. They cannot find that space, so they turn to PC, to Steam, and those that have the investment for that, to develop console games, just like Black Myth Wukong, because Black Myth Wukong, the developers were also working on mobile before. So it's not so much that the world is being more receptive to Chinese games, it's more that the Chinese games felt, the developers, they felt the urgency and the need to expand to the rest of the world to keep growing. If that need wasn't there, if the Chinese market still had enough space on mobile in particular to grow, then we probably would have not seen Black Myth Wukong and many other games now that we're going to see soon, like Phantom Blade Zero and all these other AAA Chinese games. They would probably still be focusing on mobile in China if they could grow in that department, because at the end of the day, it's all about money, most of it. So that's something I think many people don't really see that perspective. But it's really a matter of survival for a lot of these developers. If they don't expand and launch their games outside of China, they just wouldn't have the space in China to create hits, to make games that would really penetrate the market in any substantial way. Even the top 100, not even to mention the top 10 or 5 of the most played games. And of course, if they were to develop on consoles and on PC, the market outside of China is much bigger than the market in China for that. Even though PC is huge in China, yes, and the console market is growing a lot, yes, but obviously the global market is much bigger still than the Chinese market. So it only makes sense from a financial and a growth perspective for Chinese developers to invest in the outside world. So it's not, I just want to make it clear, I think, because sometimes there's some arrogance, I think some geocentrism from people outside of China. I'm going to say in the West. I don't like saying the West because, again, it's a very big generalization. But there's this kind of perspective that we are enabling the Chinese market to grow with our games by launching them in China and by buying the Chinese games outside. But no, it's actually a very active and strategic move from Chinese developers and publishers, and not the other way around. We're living in China's world, basically, in terms of strategy, in terms of positioning, and not the other way around. Yeah.
Tell me, and guys, apologies again. This is one of the best conversations we ever had here. We need to do this more often. It's turning into a TED Talk on China. But just a quick follow up, because I don't want to lose the answer to that question. How we just to have an understanding of the consumer behavior.
Right.
Do people have more appetite for games built in China, or people are agnostic? They either play Chinese games or Western games. They don't care. What do you think?
I think people are very agnostic, and we have the data and we have the evidence that many games, non-Chinese games, have been very successful, both historically over the decades and recently in China. Like I always use the example of It Takes Two. It Takes Two sold like 10 million copies in China. This was Hazel Lights, the Joseph Fares. So we have games like Cyberpunk 2077 that sold millions in China as well. Animal Crossing. I mean, there's plenty of Japanese games that sell a lot in China. So Chinese gamers are, I think Chinese gamers, generally speaking, actually are closer in taste to what we see in the West than what you would see in Japan, because people like to put China and Japan together sometimes, and that's a big mistake because China and Japan are really in many ways radically different in terms of behavior and tastes, and there's a reason to that. China went from basically people having bootleg consoles in the 80s and the 90s, and then transitioned a little bit to mobile when the mobile became mainstream, like in 2007 and with the iPhone, and PC in between. So for China, in China, genres like FPS, like first-person shooters, have been extremely popular in China, historically speaking. Franchises like Counter-Strike and Crossfire and a few other Chinese ones, locals, they've been huge. You cannot find anyone, any millennial in China who has not played CS, like Counter-Strike. It's really amazing. And this is something that's totally different from what we see in Japan. Japanese consumers, generally speaking, are kind of allergic to FPS or third-person shooters or anything like that, while Chinese gamers are very, very familiar to that. So that kind of molds the behavior and how they are open also to those kinds of genres from games from all around the world.
It's really cool. It shows, I take a big take from your answer, this that gamers don't care about politics, borders, or nationalities. They care about good games, good products. And Adele, I found your next spot for you to start practicing Counter-Strike. You said you are ruling here in the West. I'm the best player of Counter-Strike, but you haven't played against Chinese players, man.
I have to say, and maybe I will get some hate for that, but Asian team are not yet as strong as European team on CS. I have to say, League of Legends and MOBAs, we are out of the discussion. They are taking everything. But that's a super interesting subject because, like, if I can go back a little about the misconception you started with, I really don't have those misconceptions because since I was a child, I was playing like Asian game, like One of the first game I played was by Nexon Games, a South Korean developer. It was Maple Story, so it's a MMORPG. Like it was basically the Asian World of Warcraft 2D, and I don't know. Since I was a child, I was exposed to Asian games. So Asia has always been like a light year away from us on gaming. And yeah, Nexon, Pokemon, everything Nintendo does, Sony, like there is a lot of game that I can think of that really brings me to my childhood, and I know it's made by Asian people like South Korea, Japan, China, and stuff like that. So for me, the Asian market has a lot to offer us, and it's really weird to hear now that they have to go out of their region to survive, because I was the one going there to try to find good games, you know, and I've always find quality games and stuff like that whenever I go to Asia. It's really interesting, refreshing. It gives a whole new meaning at everything. To me, they don't even need to come to us. Asia is 2 billion people. Do they need us to make their game work and to sell their game?
Yeah, but I'm sorry to interrupt, but I would
No?
interject there because I think that's precisely one of the misconceptions. So the problem is, and please don't take offense. I'm just saying in a
No,
very.
no.
The problem is you're talking about Asia and you're talking about Japan and you're talking about South Korea, but China is a totally different planet, basically. None of the games you played when you were young were from China. I'm willing to bet. We all grew up with Japanese games. We all grew up with Nintendo, with Sega, with whatever, Squaresoft, Neo Geo, SNK, you name it, right? Capcom. Obviously,
Yeah.
there's no. This is not even a topic that Japan has been arguably the most influential market gaming source of gaming in the world, more than the US and more than Europe for sure. I mean, all consoles were from Japan up until
Yeah.
the Xbox, well, and before the Atari and whatever and the others, but still, for the most successful ones, more iconic ones, it's almost all from Japan. But China does not enter that conversation up until like 2010 or so. Like there's just no China in the worldwide context of gaming until very recently, and that's the thing. So we can never, and this is something I talk a lot when I talk with developers when they want to launch games in China. Unfortunately, a lot of them have this idea about their go-to-market strategy to launch their games, and they think they can basically use the same strategy for South Korea and Japan and China precisely. And that's what I always tell people, like, no, like, forget about it. Like China, imagine China is its own planet. It's completely different from South Korea or Japan in terms of market and in terms of resources and in terms of regulations and history and everything. There's absolutely nothing that you would do in China specifically that would necessarily work in Japan or in South Korea if you're going to launch your game and market it there, because everything is different from the platforms that you market the game, how you distribute it, how you reach your consumer is totally different. So I'm sorry, I was just because you were saying you're talking about China and but then you're talking about Japan and Korea, and again we obviously we all I assume we all here in this podcast and people listening, we all grew up with Japanese games, and I'm a huge Sega fan. I mean, the Dreamcast is my favorite console ever and whatever. But China is a totally different conversation. That's what I mean. So this phenomenon now that we see emerging from China, it's very unique and own thing, and it's totally unrelated to whatever happened or is happening in Japan, and even more so in South Korea. Although South Korea is also a mixed market, let's say, because it's much more friendly to PC gaming. Historically speaking, it's kind of similar to China in that regard, but it is an open market. It's a democracy. It's a much more flexible market than China ever was or probably ever will be for as long as things are the way they are. So
Did you
yeah.
just say that China is not a democracy? Did I read that
Uh,
between the lines?
yeah, I'm okay to say China is a totalitarian state. I have no issues in saying that because that's just the truth. I'm not afraid to say that because that's another misconception that sometimes people have about China, that we live in North Korea and everything is surveilled and we cannot say anything. And while that's true to some extent, it's also not.
Yeah.
People are very chill. Like I'm not afraid that anyone to come knock on my door.
I would really like to stick with that. I think this argument that you just did is really important. It's undeniable that the influence that Japan had in the games industry, the impact that they had, they made games cool. They made games part of pop culture. We wouldn't say games are pop culture without the influence of Nintendo and others. But putting this aside, I wanted to specifically focus on the rise, this new wave of Asian games is definitely led by Chinese developers and Chinese publishers. I've seen it, the market is seeing it, and Gamescom, I've seen it there. And I think maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that. Obviously, we are talking about one of the countries with one of the richest histories in the world, probably one of the oldest, if not the oldest country. And I see a lot of these new games being based off Chinese history and so on. And they are really cool because we are not used to this. And again, I need to piggyback, Adele, this is one of my favorites, Black Myth. But there's others. How do you have a take on this? And then a second one, because you mentioned something, I have this on the list of questions for you. The last game that I've launched specifically in China, I wanted to publish a game there and was a pain in the ass. It was a pain in the ass to find a local. So we had to open a corporate presence on site. This corporate presence had to be owned 51% by a local partner. And then there was the whole technicalities of localizing a game is not what people think. Just translate the game and it's done. It's not. Translation, adapting the economics, game design, even game design we had to adapt. So it was a pain. And I'm talking, this was in 2013. So I mean, imagine fast forward now. Can you give us a take? How much has this changed? Is it more or less the same process? Yes or no? And also, if you would have some tips for developers, for publishers that want to break into the Chinese market, what they should look at and so on. But let's start with the first one. Was about the influence of Chinese culture and Chinese history in this new wave of games.
Well, I mean, I'm going to go back to Japan because actually, I mean, all this Chinese mythology and folklore used in Chinese games, I mean, this is a natural thing to happen, just like it would happen in many games from other regions. So it's only natural that they would base themselves on that. But we've seen that influence already in Japanese games because, and this might be a little controversial for me to say for some people, but it's not wrong, I think. A lot of Japanese culture is based also on Chinese folklore. I mean, the whole written system for language in China comes from Chinese, and I mean, Taoism and all that stuff also comes from China. Japanese culture is basically a consequence of Chinese export throughout millennia and throughout the centuries. And we've seen a lot of that in Japanese games throughout the years, in Japanese RPGs and whatever, that deal with Japanese folklore. They have their own identity, of course. But a lot of that, actually, if you show that to many Chinese gamers, they will say, oh, that's whatever the equivalent we have in China as well. We see a lot of that, even if you talk about games like Dynasty Warriors or other Japanese IPs based on Chinese history. These are themes that are fairly familiar for people, not only in China, but also in Japan. We can go even to Korea and even countries in Southeast Asia, from Vietnam to Laos, Myanmar, has a lot of this cultural and historical influence from history. So just like we have, like say, for example, in Europe, there's this tendency perhaps to make games about medieval fantasy themes. And also in America, right? I mean, we have games and fiction and pop culture from Lord of the Rings and whatever. It's all based on medieval themes besides the fantastical elements. So in the same way, that's the European-centric perspective of fiction and whatever. In the same way, in China, we have all these other themes that influence not only China, but all the nations around it as well, at least from the eastern side, not so much perhaps from the Central Asian side, because that's more influenced by older Persian and Arab influences and all that. But at least in the East and Southeast Asia, it's very much that cultural influence. So that dictates really what people are comfortable developing and creating, and that's the natural result. And that's why we saw games like Black Myth Wukong, which I loved as well, and recently we had the Wushang Fallen Feathers, which is also based on the Ming Dynasty. And we have countless many other games on mobile, and even games like Genshin Impact, which have anime aesthetic. They still have elements, like cultural elements, that are very much rooted in Chinese history and Chinese mythology, even though they are masked with a more cartoonish and kind of Japanese anime aesthetic. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that answers the first part. Now we can hop on to the launching or publishing a
Oh yeah,
game
yeah.
in China. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually my job. That's what I've been doing the most, and what I did as a business developer when I worked for a publisher here, helping developers to launch their games in China, just like you did in 2013. This goes back to the topic I mentioned about the parallel markets before. If you're going to launch a game in China officially and through all the official channels, it's mandatory you need to have a Chinese partner. When a developer, and in particular in mobile, which is the most amount of games, wants to launch a game in China, they cannot just simply self-publish the game in China. If they want to go through the official channels, they need to find a Chinese publisher, and then basically that Chinese publisher will operate everything for those games within China. This is what we see, for example, with most Activision and Blizzard games. There was that big scandal a couple of years ago when they broke up with the NetEase, which was operating World of Warcraft and their other games in China, and then they broke up, and then now they're back together. But even for any other games, either console, PC, or mobile, if you're going to go through the formal channels, you need to have that publishing license. And yes, then that publisher will help the developer with localization, which, yes, might include changes in the actual game if it has any content that is obviously that goes against like censorship guidelines in China. So that's why you'll never see a game like GTA getting a publishing license in China. That's impossible. You would have to change the whole game basically. It would just be a desert map and you just ride a bike and do nothing else. But that's for the official formal way of launching a game. Now what has changed, I think, from 2013 until now is that many developers, maybe not all, but many developers and publishers around the world realize that they don't need to do any of this. What they need to focus on, in particular for PC and console games, I'll leave mobile on the side for now, but for console and PC games, premium games, basically what they need to do is make sure that the game has Chinese in terms of settings in language, and then making sure that they have a good strategy to promote the game in China. And for that, they do not need a publisher. There's been a boom in marketing agencies helping developers and publishers from around the world to help them launch the games in China. And what they basically do is they hire services, they hire KOLs, influencers, to stream their games in Chinese streaming channels and to publish content on the Chinese social media channels like Weibo, Douyin, which is like the Chinese TikTok, and many other places, Bilibili and Little Red Book, Xiaohongshu, and many other platforms. The point is discoverability. That's really what's important for PC and console games. It's for them to be found by Chinese audiences. That's really the challenge. And for that, you don't really need to go through the formal channels to have a publishing license and to have a Chinese publisher to do that. You can just make sure that Chinese consumers can know about your game and then can find it, and then they will by themselves, they will buy it either on Steam or they will buy it from PSN or from Xbox Live or the eShop or whatever, using either the imported consoles or using accounts from other countries, which is totally 100% normalized in China for people to do that. So again, like I mentioned before, you had games like It Takes Two that sold 10 million copies. You had games like, I don't know, like Ring Fit for the Switch that also sold millions of copies. We had Stellar Blade recently, which does not have a publishing license, and it would never have it for China just because of all the, all the sexy content and whatever. They would never go with that. But it still sold more than 1 million units when it launched in China on PC. We have Death Stranding 2, which is its biggest user base is in China so far. The sales for the game have been apparently kind of disappointing, and that's why they haven't been mentioning much still since the game launched. But still, the biggest slice of gamers for Death Stranding, according to people I know from analysts from well-known companies, it's in China, and on the PS5 it's in China. And again, these games, they're not launched, they don't have a publishing license, so they did not go through those hoops that you're saying that you did in 2013. In fact, I would argue against doing that, really. I think it's a waste of resources, in particular for PC and console games. For mobile, the situation is totally different because for mobile, you only have iOS in China and you don't have Google Play. Google Play is banned, nobody can access Google Play. I mean, anyone can access if they have a VPN, and many people have, like me and whatever. But for the normies, for most casual audiences, there is no Google Play, so the market on Android is divided through literally hundreds of app stores, although there's a handful of them that are the major ones, like from Xiaomi, from Huawei, and a few others. So a publisher, if it releases a game on mobile, on Android, it needs to work with all these app stores. And this is really the work that only a Chinese publisher can do. Unlike consoles and PCs where you can launch your game on Steam and Chinese gamers will find it on Steam, for mobile, a foreign company cannot release the games on mobile on the Chinese app stores. It just doesn't have the access. So you need to integrate SDKs into the game so that the game is compatible with the Chinese monetization and payment systems for the servers and all this stuff, because you're dealing, and the ads systems, which is how many of the games are monetized as well. This is something you really need to work with a partner in China, and you need to go through the former channels. There's also ways to release the games on mobile outside of the former channels through other app stores, but then you're going to be missing out on the potential of really reaching the top of the rankings. And again, and I'm sorry to bore you about talking about mobile, I know nobody cares, but mobile is the muscle of the industry. If you remove mobile, the gaming industry becomes less than half of what it is. This is the livelihood for most developers actually in the world and everything. But what I was going to say, just to end, for mobile, you depend on user acquisition. You depend on the budgets for user acquisition to promote the games and to make them visible, basically, for that discoverability thing. It needs to have the user acquisition. And in China, only if you have a Chinese publisher can you do that. You cannot do that from the outside. There's just no way. You cannot meddle with the Chinese systems in that way. So it's very different from PC and console. And again, I'm talking in very general terms. There's a lot of nuance and detail to all this. But yeah, just for people to have an idea.
Daniel, it sounds like you just released a golden tip, perhaps specifically for indie developers that might think that releasing or launching their games in China is a huge hassle, and it actually doesn't need to be. Would you say that specifically in the indie scene, how does that look in China? And do you think globally that indies might be missing out on this opportunity?
It's hard. I mean, because the indie scene in China, if we're talking about PC specifically, which it's where most indies are, right, on Steam, although of course there's many on mobile and console. It's hard to compete in China. While it's easy to make games available in China from a perspective of just being available to people, it's still hard to make them noticed. And it's even harder, of course, for indie games, just like it is anywhere in the world, right? I mean, there's like thousands of games that are released on Steam every year, and most people never hear about them. They never know about them, which is very sad. But people just don't have the time. It's impossible. There's too many games. So as an indie developer, if you're gonna try to potentialize the game on China, you have to struggle with the same thing. You're still gonna have to make people know about the game somehow. So you're gonna have to promote it on socials in China towards Chinese gamers, and you need to localize the game. You need to at least make sure that it's localized in Chinese, the language and the text in the game. So, but yeah, that's pretty much it.
I really appreciate that you brought in the indies angle. Indies now are going through this new renaissance age, and sometimes they are forgotten. I do not forget the mobile. I don't see mobile as the poor cousin of gaming. Mobile is the fastest, even though it decreased the speed, it's still the fastest growing platform and it takes most of the market. Platforms have changed, discoverability have changed, consumption habits have changed. The way, and this I think is transversal to all countries and continents and so on. So the way players find, watch, consume games, it's nothing like it was years ago. And studios that don't see that, don't adapt, basically are irrelevant, are invisible, etc. Now, you've mentioned something new. This for me was a golden nugget here. So we don't need to go through, and then maybe you can connect that with the indies as well. We don't need to go through the formal established channels of to publish a game there, to go to have a local office. You can use an agency, and the agency will support you via KOLs, influencers, and whatnot in the whole process of launching your game in that market. I'm not even sure if we can really can call it launching the game in that market, because you are basically,
Yeah,
in fact, even though it's
exactly.
localized to some extent, you are just promoting it. You are actually not officially launching it, but you are telling
Exactly.
me that this is more effective than the formal official way.
It is, and exactly. It's important to make that distinction. I'm not suggesting, from a legal standpoint, that developers don't need to do that partnership with the local Chinese publisher. Just legally speaking, they do need that. That did not change. It's just the practicality of the market showed that actually people do not really need to do that in practice. But of course, if you're going to Gamescom or any other event, you're gonna have all these publishers there, like represented by their business developers, and they all gonna try to pitch you the same pitch, the same story, which is what I did when I worked for a Chinese publisher. They're gonna tell you that yes, you absolutely need a Chinese publisher to launch your game in China, and blah blah, and they will sell you that as a service. Most of them, depending on the scale of your game, but usually they're gonna basically sell you that as a service, and it's legitimate. That's legally how it should be done. But again, the market in China is so flexible, not only in gaming but in many other things, that I'm going to go back to the example of It Takes Two. The game never launched officially in China. It sold more than 10 million copies in China, and it even won the award from Bilibili, which is one of the major streaming platforms in China. It won the award for Game of the Year in the big awards here in China, even though the game is not launched in China. So you could not have a more visible game that's obviously unregulated but still very successful in China. This is like the main case study that you can use, and that's why I say yes, you can go through agencies, but the agencies will not help you to actually launch the game in China. The agencies are simply to help you to make the game visible to Chinese gamers, and that's pretty much it.
Wow, Daniel, honestly, I think I could ask a ton more questions to you and I can listen to your deep knowledge of the Chinese market. So I'm gonna skim it down to one more to wrap it up. Let's talk about the future outlook of the Chinese market. Where do you see it going?
I have one concern about if we're going to talk about this new wave of games coming out of China, in particular these AAA games, which is what most of our core gamers like to talk about. There's a really big concern for me in terms of differentiation between the games. I think a lot of people are already getting tired. Like all these games are kind of looking like the same. Like it's all like kind of like Souls likes or third person action adventure games. Like we've just seen this recent one, Swords of Justice, Gujian, and then you have Phantom Blade Zero. You have obviously Black Myth Wukong. You have Where Winds Meet. You have a few others now that I cannot come up top of my head. And all these games, they all kind of look the same. They kind of, even though they might be play differently, but they kind of based on the same themes, on the same Chinese folklore. Chinese studios really need to make sure that they can expand creatively, let's say. Even though in execution they're already proven that they're very, very good. I think nobody can deny that. Anyone who played Black Myth Wukong, they know that. I mean, there's very talented developers here, and it's incredible what they did in such a short amount of time, and so few people in the studio, and many others like that. But yeah, I think in the future we're probably gonna see a creative explosion. Again, not because people are necessarily so creative, but because it will be a matter of survival again, where Chinese developers, if they want their games to compete in the rest of the world, they will have to differentiate themselves more, visually speaking, and in terms of aesthetics, and even the genres, really. We haven't seen any Chinese FPS, we haven't seen any like Chinese racing game or whatever. We haven't seen many Chinese beat 'em up or anything like that, even though beat 'em ups are huge in China. They're very popular. Like people love King of Fighters and stuff like that. It's historically very popular in China. But we haven't seen anything like that hit the mainstream yet. It's always third person action adventure, Souls like, and then you have the gacha games on mobile like Genshin Impact and all that stuff that also all pretty much look the same. They all have the same Japanese anime aesthetic. If I'm gonna talk about trends in the future, I think Chinese developers will very quickly realize that if they keep doing the same, people will lose interest. It will stagnate. The audience will not be there. Then we will see another wave of new different genres and different games coming out of China. And when that happens, and it will probably happen in the next 5 to less years even. When that happens, then Chinese developers will really start to eat away of the market share from other big developers from around the world, which they are already doing in some genres, in Japan in particular, and even for European developers and all that, not only because of the cost of labor and all that. But creatively speaking, I think we'll see Chinese games really eat away of that market share, because the way they will do it is, first they will always do games that are recognizable to the masses. Kind of, I don't want to say they're copies, but they are games that will be very inspired by very well established IPs, and then they spread from that and create their own angles on that, and then they will really take over a lot of IPs that we recognize. And yeah, I think that's my prediction if I have one. International developers and publishers, it's kind of, I would say, it's an unstoppable trend, I think, but still they need to prepare for that. And those who don't, we will see a lot more layoffs. This is not, people think we've seen a lot of layoffs in the last few years, but I think 10 years from now, if nothing changes politically and whatever, if no comet hits the earth or anything like that, if there's no revolution in China or anything like that, we will see Chinese development and the output from Chinese developers really kind of annihilate a lot of international developers and publishers, because we need to understand the context. Like, just in one city, for example, an important game development hub in China, which is Chengdu, which is a city where there are studios from Ubisoft, from Team 17,
The
and from
pandas,
many
the
others.
pandas city.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But that city alone has more than 6,000 registered companies that work in the gaming industry, and that's just one city. So it's really, and this keeps growing. There's more and more investment in gaming. So in 10 years from now, we will see the Chinese market being bigger, just in terms of manpower and in terms of amount of studios, bigger than probably the whole world combined in terms of the gaming industry. It will scale in a way that it will become inevitable, and it will be very hard for international developers and publishers to compete with that. And I don't think nobody's really talking about that. And I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I really see it as inevitable, just as it has been inevitable for smartphones in the last 15 years and other gadgets, just like it's becoming inevitable now for cars, for EVs, and many other things that we see coming out of China. I think for gaming, that this will also happen, for better or worse. So that's my prediction.
Vessel, let me just squeeze in two last questions. And Daniel, I will ask you to try to be brief in less than a minute. So
Okay.
the first one, what are you looking for in terms of market-wise? What is there something that you have on your radar, something that is keeping you really excited that you see, oh shit, this has a lot of potential? And the second question is, you've mentioned GTA is not available in Chinese market, but I wonder if Chinese people still play it and if they have access to it.
Yeah. To answer the second question very quickly, Chinese people have access to any game you can imagine. That's the thing that I want to make very clear. You can buy any game or any console in China. You can find it on e-commerce. I buy all my games here. That's not an issue. So yes, people can definitely buy GTA. And for the first question, I don't know, you mean it's something that I'm excited, like a game in particular, or what
In
do you mean?
general, you pick. What is the thing that has you more excited?
This will be controversial because I know people hate, but
We
AI,
love controversies.
I don't like AI people, all those tech bros and whatever, but I do think there is a lot of potential on generative AI in gaming. And again, I know people will hate me saying this, but I am looking forward, not now, but maybe 10 years from now, when you can actually play a game and you can organically talk to an NPC and get in real time answers from NPCs and stuff like that. If they can manage to do that well, and if it does not hurt the industry in terms of manpower and all that, I think that's very exciting, because that's really kind of the fantasy dream that we have as gamers since we're kids, right? To be in a game where things interact with us organically. And that's not something that can be scripted. If it's scripted, there's always limitations to that. And again, Chinese developers are on the forefront of the cutting edge of the use of AI in games. And again, I know now everything looks like slop, everything looks very bad, and I'm not advocating for that kind of nonsense. I hate that stuff. But big picture, I think the potential can be also very positive down the road, and I'm curious. I hope to see it.
Guys, I'm definitely very curious about what kind of games are going to come out of China in the future. Adele, I think you will be too, and I hope, because you're having a great eye on indies. Whenever you see something cool coming out, You just tell us. And
Man, I mean, this is what I love. And actually, I want to just quickly come back to something that was said just before. Asian doesn't really get into FPSs and stuff like that, but they did. Like the last year, we have two FPS that came out of Asia. I think it's China, by the way. I think I can say China. Let me just check. I think Fragpunk is NetEase.
Yeah. But like I said, I'm sorry to interrupt. Like I said before, the distinction is Japan and China. What I was saying is, Chinese are very, very familiar with
Yeah,
FPS. They love like Crossfire is one of the biggest games ever.
yeah,
But not Japan. They're
yeah.
very much the opposite when it comes to that.
But I can't wait to see how the evolution, because obviously I think the AI stuff you said will happen. And I think that the time you gave is correct. I think we have to wait like 5, 10 years to see NPC organically answer to us and interact with us. To me, the next big thing happening is a revolution on the FPSs and TPSs. I think we will see a lot of changes. I think the extraction shooter genre will prevail a lot. Delta Force is Chinese and
Yes.
it shows great numbers. So it's still not CS, it's still not PUBG, it's still struggling to get to those numbers. But to me, the next big genre will come from China, surely.
Yeah,
Adele,
But
are you just trying to apologize for the fact that you just said that Chinese players suck in FPSs? You said this minutes ago.
I said European were
Uh,
still better.
okay. Okay.
I didn't say that. I said I'm sure I
and
will get destroyed by any Chinese. Especially they love esport, man. They follow so much esport. To me,
yeah.
it's the temple of gaming.
I mean, Call of Duty Mobile, Valorant Mobile, the new
PUBG
Destiny,
Mobile.
Destiny, whatever. Yeah, well, PUBG, yeah, mix, but yeah, Call of Duty Mobile and Valorant and the new Destiny, they're all developed by Chinese studios. And like you mentioned, Delta Force as well. Again, because a lot of these Chinese developers, they grew up on FPS, on playing CS and on
Yeah,
playing Crossfire, and they're very, very talented at this kind of at this genre. So that's why we're gonna see even more, I think.
makes me happy.
still, the one thing you said earlier is that the millennials in China grew up with CS.
Yeah.
Just an episode before, we were talking about, I'm on the edge of millennial myself, that we all grew up with The Sims. So I think it's badass. I think Chinese millennials are cooler than us, just based on that fact.
What
But
have we
yeah, thank
learned?
you so
What have we
much.
learned here today? That the games market is exploding and will continue growing. Looking at the market without considering China is like looking at basketball without considering NBA. Basically, it's a good one.
I think, Rod, you summarized
Yeah,
it
makes sense.
perfectly. All
Do we still
right.
have time for a lame joke? Daniel, you haven't been
Yes.
exposed to this.
Please, please,
Uh,
please.
we have a lame joke, and today I have to adapt because usually we play around with our nationalities, but let's see how this goes. So, two Portuguese, a Dutch and a French, walk into a bar. The bartender asks, "Who's paying?" The Portuguese looks at the other Portuguese and says, "You pay." The second Portuguese points at the Dutch, and the Dutch points at the French. And the French zips his wine, saying, "I only play with style."
It's
Very,
It's good. It's
I,
good.
hold
I
up to the
only
expectation.
with style. I try to make my best French accent, but it's tricky.
I don't
We'll
think I
improve
can
any
do it.
episode.
Vessel,
Thank you, Daniel, for joining us
My
and
pleasure.
giving your really interesting insights on the Chinese market. And yeah, this was episode 2 of the Raw podcast. I hope you all enjoyed it. And
how is this
we'll
the
see
two?
you
How is this
around.
two of what? Two of three
No, this is number 2.
Number
officially.
Last time
two.
was number 1, and the
Okay,
first
okay.
one was number
It
zero.
was
Zero,
zero.
zero.
We had episode zero. Daniel, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time,
Thank you. Thank
and
you.
we hope to having you here again. Just shed some
Any
light
anytime.
on
Yeah,
not only on the Chinese market, but on the whole games industry.
yeah.
Anytime. Thank
Really a
you.
pleasure, man.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for
Thank you.
having me. I love talking about gaming, so yeah, anytime, please.
And that's why we're here.
That's
Yeah.
why we're here.
All right.
Julio.
Take care, everyone.
Have a great one.
Bye
Here,
bye.
see you. Ciao, ciao.